Good morning, Dr. McClelland. Can you hear me? Now, I can't hear you.
Yes.
Ah, good. And you can see me?
Yes, I can.
Good. Now, you are in the Belfast City Hospital, are you?
Well, I'm actually in the Blood Transfusion Centre headquarters, which is in the Belfast City Hospital.
And are you there on your own?
Just with legal representatives next door.
Mm-hmm. And I think there is a technician on hand in case the IT has problems.
Yes, in this room as well.
Good. You're talking to Aldwych House in London. We have a select and small group of people in this room, but you're talking more particularly to the public who are watching online. There will be at any one time around 100 or so people listening. So that is the audience which will be listening to your answers once you have been sworn. Mary will ask you to affirm in a moment. And then Miss Richards will ask you the questions. Mary, please.
Please state your full name.
William Morris McClelland.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. McClelland, can you see and hear me? You can?
Yes.
Good. You took up your post as Consultant and Deputy Director of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service in August 1978. Is that right?
That's correct.
Before you joined the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, what was your clinical experience and practice?
Was after my houseman year in 71 to 72, I went through a training program in hematology and laboratory medicine. From 72 to 75, I was based in the laboratories at the Belfast City Hospital. So that involved not just hematology, but also histopathology, biochemistry, and bacteriology. I then moved to the Royal Hospital in 75 until 78, and that was based in hematology. There was greater emphasis there when I was there on the clinical aspect of hematology. So I worked for a considerable amount of the time in the ward, in the inpatient, also a day patient centre. That involved treatment of patients with leukemia and indeed haemophilia. And but there was also a laboratory component, including blood transfusion, hospital blood transfusion practice.
Now, when you moved to the Blood Transfusion Service in August 1978, I think the director at that time was Colonel Field. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were Deputy Director until May of 1980. During that time, you've told us in your statement you had a range of 1 to 2 month placements in regional transfusion centres in Edinburgh, Bristol and London. What was the purpose of those placements?
To learn as much as I could about running a blood transfusion centre. My experience until my appointment had been entirely hospital-based. I had spent occasional 1 week periods in the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Centre, but it was very much a requirement for me to broaden my experience in other blood transfusion centres to learn how other people, other centres carried on their work, to gather up ideas about developments. I think we were very, when I say we, I mean Colonel Field and myself, we were very conscious of the relatively isolated position being in Northern Ireland. It was very essential for me to spend periods of time like that in other centres.
And then in June 1980, you became the director of the Blood Transfusion Service in Northern Ireland when Colonel Field retired.
Yes.
And you remained in that post with that title until May of 1994, and then with effect from June 1994 to July 2009, you were Chief Executive and Medical Director of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service Agency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as I understand it from your witness statement, Dr. McClelland, that the main difference with the latter role, the agency role, was that you had a greater degree of budgetary responsibility in that role and a greater degree of monitoring by the agency board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But essentially, from June of 1980 to July of 2009, you were in charge of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service.
That's correct. I was responsible to the board, the agency board, for the general management of the blood transfusion service.
Now, I want to ask you a little, first of all, about the facilities that were available to you when you joined the service in 1978 and then became director in 1980. The headquarters of the Blood Transfusion Service, were they in Durham Street in Belfast?
That's right, yes.
And is it right to understand that they were not part of a hospital, the physical site of a hospital?
No, it was the Durham. I can explain, if you like me to, a little bit of the background. This was an old chest clinic. It was an old building and had been used as the main chest clinic in Belfast. It was, I maybe should explain, my Colonel Field, when he took over in '69, actually the service was not only physically but administratively separate. In other words, the laboratories and the donor administration were separate organizations and physically separate. When Colonel Field took over, he did two things. One, he merged those two aspects of the service, which was very much in keeping with every other transfusion centre in the UK. And he also located this centre in Durham Street, this chest clinic, and it was refurbished for the purpose. It was only ever intended to be a temporary arrangement. That's what Colonel Field always said to me, that it was intended to suffice for perhaps 10 to 15 years, and then the plan at that time was that there would should be provided a new purpose-designed centre. That took rather longer to achieve.
And you told us in your statement that the building was increasingly unsatisfactory for a blood transfusion service. And it was accepted really from the time you were a director in 1980 that there was a need for a new building, but that didn't happen, I think, until 1995.
That's right. That's right. It was, well, increasingly, as more developments took place, it was increasingly short of space to start with, and just the general environment for transfusion operation, it did not meet what would have been considered the requirements of a transfusion centre.
Now, in terms of staffing, you've told us in your statement that Colonel Field operated largely single-handedly for much of his tenure, but when you became director, you recruited a deputy director and consultant, and that was Dr. Barucha, was it?
That's correct. Yes, in 1981.
And you had two operational managers, one with responsibility for the laboratory side and one with responsibility for the donor programme. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. I probably should have added in my statement, in addition, at that time, the head nurse who was responsible for the blood donor attendance actually reported directly to me for a number of years. Then in 1992, a new donor services manager was appointed who was responsible for the donor attendance as well as other staff.
And there were a range of medical staff and blood donor attendants, but I'll come on to ask you about those in a while when we look at the donor collection arrangements. Want to start next then by asking you to look with me at some annual reports of the Eastern Health and Social Services Board, Dr. McClelland, which I hope made their way to you overnight.
Yes, I just got a chance to look at them about half an hour ago.
Good, good. Well,
yes.
Although they're long documents, I'm only going to take you to the sections relating to the blood transfusion service. Sally, could we have RHSC 00000078, please? You'll see, Dr. McClelland, this is the annual report of the Eastern Health and Social Services Board for the year 1980. Sally, could we go to, I think it should be page 41. So at the bottom of the page, there's a heading, Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service and Blood Transfusion Service Laboratories. And I'm just going to read those paragraphs. This was a difficult year for the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, and for the first time in recent years, the number of units of blood collected was actually less than in the previous year. This was the case in spite of the fact that the total number of donation sessions was increased. The reduction was undoubtedly due to the effects of the recession, with resulting factory closures and payoffs. In spite of this, the needs of all hospitals in Northern Ireland for blood and blood products were met. During the year, a total of 66,401 donations were made to the service. This again included emergencies when donors attended at all hours of the day and night. Good cooperation is still being received from employers who continue to permit sessions to be held on their premises and in many cases permit employees to attend nearby sessions during working hours. If we can just keep that on the screen, Sally, before we go to the next page. What was it that made this a difficult year? There's a reference to the recession and factory closures. Why did that have an impact upon the blood transfusion service?
Factories and other places of work were a very important source of donors in those days, certainly. If you compare factories and workplaces with public sessions, the percentage of members of the public, of people donating was much higher in those facilities, perhaps for fairly obvious reason that people were able. It was much more convenient with the service visiting their place of work, whatever the reason. That was these were a very, very important source of blood donors. And of course, when if a factory closed down, or I mean, to give the example of perhaps best known in Northern Ireland, the shipyards at Harlington Wolff, we used to go there for a full week. There were enough staff to enable us to collect blood for a full week. Some years later, that was down to 1 day. And there are numerous examples like that. And of course, when those places of work closed down, they had to be replaced. We had to find alternatives, and that took a lot of effort and time to do.
You also, in your witness statement, Dr. McClelland, as well as referring to the impact of factory closures, also refer to the impact of the Troubles
Yes.
on the work of the blood transfusion service. In broad terms, how did that make the blood transfusion services role more problematic? What difficulties did it cause?
Well, from 2 points of view. First of all, of course, demand for blood, as you can imagine, especially during major trauma episodes like bombings and so on. There could be a very sudden increase in the demand for blood at short notice. So that was one aspect. The other, of course, is just the security situation itself. If you start with the headquarters in Durham Street, Durham Street turned out to be not a very suitable location. It was rather close to areas of civil strife, and it was directly affected, certainly during the 70s. And into the 80s and beyond by bombings. There were times when the centre actually had to be evacuated during such episodes. So that was the headquarters. But yes, throughout the province, there were areas where one had to take account of the impact of the Troubles in terms of arranging sessions. I must say, in terms of cross-community support, that was often extremely good. Nevertheless, there could have been fears among donors about in mixed communities crossing to a particular venue. So there were issues there that would have had an effect.
If we go to the next page, please, of this report. can see at the top of the page it says new centres opened during the year were as follows, and we can see reference there to a young offenders centre and Ebrington Barracks. I'll come back to the issues raised by donor sessions in locations such as those a little later, Dr. McClelland. If we then go to if we skip the next paragraph, the paragraph after that records, during the year recruitment was commenced for a special panel of blood donors who were prepared to undergo pheresis on the cell separator machine, which is sited in the Royal Victoria Hospital. This procedure is used to collect white cells, which are of value mainly in the treatment of patients with acute leukemia. I'll come back to the question of plasmapheresis again later. Then it continues, the increasing need for blood components resulted in a larger proportion of the blood collected being fractionated. This is reflected in the increased number of concentrated red cells prepared and also the increased production of platelet concentrates and fresh frozen plasma. The laboratory continued to send plasma for fractionation to the Blood Products Laboratory, Elstree, and in return received plasma protein fraction and other blood components. Some of these components were sent from BPL directly to hospital units, e.g. factor IX and certain immunoglobulins, and these are not included in the statistics. Other blood components supplied by the blood bank were cryoprecipitate dried plasma and anti-D immunoglobulin. Again, Dr. McClelland, I'm going to come back to the question of arrangements with BPL in a little while. And then if we go to a little further down, we can see a paragraph beginning, the hepatitis laboratory continues to test all blood donors and antenatal patients for the presence of hepatitis B antigen, and I'll come back to that again later. And then the final paragraph, during the year, doctors, medical laboratory scientific officers, and for the first time, medical students were given tuition on various aspects of blood transfusion. Just pausing there, Dr. McClelland, at that time, so 1980, what kind of tuition were you providing to doctors, MLSOs and medical students on blood transfusion?
Yes, well, on my appointment, I was asked by Professor Bridges, the Professor of Haematology, to take on the teaching of medical students in all aspects of blood transfusion. So that would have involved 2 lectures to the whole year. And then we divided the year into, I think there were 8 small groups who came to the transfusion centre. Further, more detailed instruction provided, and actually at that time were able to visit particular parts of the laboratories. So it was really all aspects of blood transfusion, laboratory aspects and clinical aspects.
And then if we can turn to page 108, please, of this document, Sally. This is an appendix which gives various statistics for the transfusion service. So we can see we have the numbers on the civilian donor panel, as at the end of 1980, the figure being 96,309. Places outside Belfast visited 125, and then it sets out centres at which donations were received. Sessions held, 230 in Belfast, 502 outside Belfast, and then donors attending sessions, 20,425 in Belfast, 52,866 outside of Belfast. And then if we just look at the table at the bottom of the page, it gives an idea of the statistics. I'll just, for present purposes, look at the figure for donations. So we can see from 1974, it's 54,000 odd. And then there seems to be a small annual increase most years, and then in 1980, a slight decrease. And then if we could go over the page, there's a heading Statistical Report 1980. I don't need to ask you about this page, but if we can go to the next page, please. Could we just go closer so we can see the figures under the heading Blood Bank, please, Sally? Thank you. So we've got there some statistics. Again, I won't go through all of them, but it gives us a sense of what was happening. Whole blood issued 57,462 units. Red cell concentrates prepared 23,630 units. Then we can see a few lines further down, plasma collected for albumin production for BPL, 6,000, and albumin production for Dublin, 1,210. A fresh frozen plasma prepared, 1,574. And then cryoprecipitate prepared, 5,080 packs prepared, and then 3,531 packs issued. And then there are various other statistics in relation to other products and components. In relation to the cryoprecipitate, are you able to assist us, Dr. McClelland, in understanding the reason for the shortfall between the volume prepared and the volume issued?
No, other than it would be really a case of demand. It does seem quite a low figure for issues, but that must be correct. Cryoprecipitate, like most blood components, where production was very much demand-led. The difference there would suggest that we would have been holding quite a large stock. Of course, the shelf life of cryoprecipitate was, I think, in the region of 6 months, at least 6 months. So I can't give an exact explanation as to why there is such a large discrepancy there, or apparent discrepancy.
I'm going to ask you to look next at the report for the following year, for 1981. Sally, could we have RHSC 5073? This is the 8th annual report, year ended 31st of December 1981. Could we go to page 38, please? We can see there the heading Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service and Blood Transfusion Service Laboratories. The effects of the recession continue to create difficulties for the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, with the resulting factory closures and redundancies. 26 sessions were lost during the year, and many of the existing factory sessions produced fewer donors. Strenuous efforts were made to compensate for this loss by opening new sessions and increasing the level of publicity. 20 new centres were opened, including a regular weekly session at the YMCA Wellington Place. The total number of sessions was increased from 732 to 758, and the needs of all the hospitals for blood and blood components were met despite many problems. During the year, a total of 64,135 donations were collected. This represented a slight decrease on the previous year's total, but there was evidence of a significant improvement during the latter months of the year as the new strategies for recruiting donors became effective. And then if we go further down the page, thank you. So about 3 paragraphs up from the bottom of your screen, Dr. McClelland, there's a paragraph beginning, the laboratory continued to send plasma for fractionation to the Blood Products Laboratory, Elstree, and in return received plasma protein fraction and other blood components. And it continues by explaining blood components supplied by the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service were cryoprecipitate, dried plasma, salt-free albumin, and anti-D immunoglobulin. So, right to understand, in a similar picture, broadly speaking, to the previous year?
Yes.
And then if we could go, please, Sally, to page 102. We've got the donor panel figures there. They're not easy to read in full because the right-hand side of the page is cut off. But if we could go 2 further pages on. Again, we've got similar statistics, and I just wanted to pick up upon the figures for cryoprecipitate. That's just over halfway down the page. Cryoprecipitate prepared, 2,918 packs. Cryoprecipitate issued, 3,473 packs. So it looks as though in that year you were producing less cryoprecipitate, although the amount actually issued was roughly the same as the previous year.
Yes. Yes, it looks like we had built up a fairly healthy stock from the previous year, and presumably had run down. That's allowed that to run down a little bit, and hence the smaller figure for number of packs prepared.
And then we can pick up the picture for 1982 at RHSC 00000076. So we've got there the 1982 annual report. If we could go please to page 34. Under the heading Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service and Blood Transfusion Service Laboratories, the report reads, the effects of the recession with resulting factory closures and redundancies continue to create difficulties for the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. 5 factory sessions were lost, but to compensate for this, 11 new centres were opened during the year. The total number of donations collected was 63,310, which represents a slight reduction on the previous year, in spite of the difficulties. The needs of all hospitals in Northern Ireland for blood and blood components were met. And then if we go, if we have the whole document, thank you. If we go to 4th paragraph, further down, in the laboratories, an important development during the year was the establishment of a link-up with the Protein Fractionation Centre Edinburgh, which produces purified proteins made from blood plasma, which it receives from transfusion centres. All plasma previously sent to the Blood Products Laboratory Elstree is now sent to the PFC for fractionation. The easier access to the Edinburgh Centre allows the transport of fresh, deep frozen plasma, which is necessary for the production of factor VIII concentrate. This protein is necessary for the treatment of haemophilia, and its usage has been increasing rapidly. Previously, factor VIII has been purchased from commercial sources, but it is hoped to become self-sufficient in the not-too-distant future. And then there's a reference to some additional laboratory tests. Again, I'm going to come back, Dr. McClelland, to the arrangements with the PFC. These documents are just by way of overview. If we can go to page 106, please, for the statistical report. Again, we've got the donor panel figures there. Can you just assist me with understanding donors removed from panel during year? We saw this in the earlier reports as well. So the 3rd figure down on the page gives a figure there of 9,338. Was that mainly because of donors reaching an age whereby donations were no longer taken from them, or was that due to assessment as for unsuitability, or what in general terms would lead to removal from the panel?
Yes, a mixture of reasons. You've mentioned exceeding the age limit for donation. We would have had a practice that if after obviously donors were called by letter to invite them to donate, if there was no response after a certain length of time. Typically, that would be 2 years, but it would vary according to the frequency of visits, I think, to that venue. But in the absence of response after a certain length of time, a donor would be no longer called, no longer invited by letter, and would therefore be removed from the panel.
And then if we go 2 pages further on, please, Sally, page 108. The bottom half of the page under the heading Blood Bank, again gives similar information to that which we've seen previously. Towards the bottom of the page, we can see the figures for cryoprecipitate packs, 3,086 prepared, 3,253 packs issued. And then if we go over the page, we can see the first 2 entries refer to the plasma being sent to Edinburgh. Outdated plasma, is that what we see referred to elsewhere as time-expired plasma, Dr. McClelland?
That's correct. That's correct, yes. It's really the same as time expired.
And then fresh frozen plasma for Edinburgh, plasma collected for fractionation for Dublin. Again, I'll come back to those. If we can just then move to the report for 1983, RHSC 00000081, please. So the 10th annual report, year ended the 31st of December 1983. If we go to page 25, please, Sally, bottom half of the page. We've got the now familiar heading, and then it explains, as in the previous 2 years, the effects of the recession with resulting factory closures and redundancies led to the loss of further donation sessions. Altogether, 15 sessions had to be closed down, of which the majority were in factories, but 13 new centres were opened. An important development was the opening of a new blood donor centre at College Street, Belfast, towards the end of the year. This is open every Tuesday and Thursday, while a session continues to be held in Durham Street on Mondays. It is hoped that this arrangement will lead to a steady increase in the number of donations collected at headquarters. And then if we go 2 paragraphs further down, it refers to a link-up between the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service and the Protein Fractionation Centre. Edinburgh was established in 1982, and during 1983, a steadily increasing supply of plasma was transported to this centre, and purified blood products received back on a pro-rata basis. The aim is to achieve self-sufficiency in all blood products, particularly factor VIII and albuminoid products, the demand for both of which is increasing rapidly. And then if we could go to page 95. We've got the figures there for the donor panel. We can see from the 5th line the number of donations, 62,283. So that, again, is a slight reduction on the previous years. And then we have the figures there for plasmapheresis and cell separator donors. If we go on a further 2 pages, we've got the blood bank figures at the bottom of the page. And if we can go over the page, top of the next page, we've got the cryoprecipitate figures, 2,432 packs prepared, 2,516 packs issued. So we can see, I think, Dr. McClelland, overall, between 1980 and 1983, a reduction in the amount of cryoprecipitate being prepared and being issued.
Yes.
And then we've got the figures in terms of plasma for Edinburgh, and we can see there, in relation to the fresh frozen plasma for Edinburgh, a significant increase, so over 5,500 kilograms there recorded. But the last report I want to ask you to look at is the following year, 1984, RHSC 000069, please. So this is the annual report for 1984. If we go to page 21, please. Bottom half of the page. It records the graph illustrates the decline in the number of donors during the period 1979 to 1983. A great deal of effort has been required to compensate for this loss by opening new public sessions, which ensured that the needs of all hospitals for blood and blood components were met. There was a slight increase in the number of donors during the year at 64,766 as against 62,283 in 1983. And then there's reference to a garden party at Hillsborough Castle. And then during the year, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, became a very public issue, not least because of the implications for blood transfusion services. A number of important measures are being taken to prevent the transmission of AIDS to recipients of blood and blood products. The virus has now been identified, and it is likely that a screening test will soon be available for detecting any blood donors who are carrying the virus. A continuing trend in blood transfusion practice has been the increasing demand for blood components, platelets, plasma products, etc., while the requirement for ordinary blood transfusion, red cells, remained fairly steady. To meet this demand, 1984 saw a further substantial increase in component production and in the supplies of plasma to the Protein Fractionation Centre, Edinburgh. And then we don't have, I'm afraid, a similar statistical report to the reports in the previous years. Does what's set out there in terms of, in particular, issues relating to numbers of donors accord with your recollection of the difficulties that were experienced in the early 1980s?
Yes, I think so. I have not seen these reports for a very, very long time. But yes, it does accord with what my memories of the particular difficulties in those early 80s with factory closures and so on. Certainly, we did have to work very hard in order to maintain supplies, and had to look at various methods, very often increasing just the number of opportunities to donate. In other words, increasing the number of venues. But there were also recruitment initiatives, which maybe are not mentioned there, but that was also important.
Now, those were reports published by the Eastern Health and Social Services Board. Is it right to understand that it was that board which provided the funding for the blood transfusion service until around 1993, 1994?
Yes, the NIBTS was responsible to the Eastern Board. And in fact, the Eastern Board held the budget. NIBTS, I was not in those days the budget holder, which was probably unusual. I think in most parts of the UK, the director was the budget holder. That's not what I inherited. So the budget was held at the Eastern Board, and management support was provided by the Eastern Board. There was a section within the Eastern Board called Management Services, which provided a range of support services. Really, in terms of funding, I suppose control was exercised by, as I say, I was not the budget holder, but control was exercised by limiting the appointment of new staff. I think that was the thing. Any small change in staff, any increase, no matter how small, required the approval of the Eastern Board. There were also special arrangements for laboratory staff, which was a special regional arrangement for funding laboratory staff and laboratory equipment. So that was considered on a regional basis, but in that there was a fixed pot of money covering all laboratories in the province, hospital diagnostic laboratories and the blood transfusion laboratories. And so each of those put in their bid each year for additional staff or sort of major items of equipment, and how that money was allocated was decided by a committee of pathologists, of senior doctors, and fed down through the boards. So there were those special arrangements in respect of laboratory services, which is obviously an important part of our business.
And do you know why it took so long to get a new headquarters, a new location and proper building?
A number of reasons. Although I was told that it had been decided that this was a temporary, the building in Durham Street was temporary. Certainly when I joined the service, there was no actual earmarking of funds or site for a new centre. So it was there as a kind of aspiration, but nothing was actually there to make it happen at that point. I obviously lobbied. It was one of my major objectives, obviously, to get a new centre. I lobbied anyone who seemed relevant to do so at the Eastern Board and the Department of Health. One of the problems we ran into with major capital development, major building works, these were operated on 5-year cycles. I remember, certainly I can't remember the first time this happened, but we ran into a situation where there was a complete, within the health service in Northern Ireland, there was a complete embargo on any capital development. So you had therefore one of these 5-year periods when there was absolutely no new money for capital development of any kind. So that was a major cause of hold up. Then when some money started to become available, there was an issue around a site, selecting an appropriate site. I certainly was keen that the centre moved to a hospital site, preferably a teaching hospital site. And that eventually happened, but there were difficulties there in achieving that.
Now, other than issues relating to funding, which obviously had an important role to play, but leaving those aside, did the Eastern Health and Social Services Board become involved in decision-making regarding the policies and practices of the transfusion service, or was that left largely to you?
Well, yes, they did. They did become involved on major issues. Obviously, I would say the first big issue, obviously, the first big issue which was brought to them and they became very involved and had to be involved in was the whole question of self-sufficiency in plasma products. I had put forward a proposal that various advantages of the move to Edinburgh and so on that led to that. And yes, and they became very much involved in that. And obviously, some major policy decisions related to AIDS later and so on, they would have been involved. Not really so much in the day-to-day running of the service, although I have to, as I think I alluded to earlier, any new additional staffing did require the approval of the Eastern Board, and there was this Department Management Services, which one had to apply to get approval for anything of that nature.
And then what about the Department of Health and Social Services in Northern Ireland? What kind of relationship did you have with that department, and what role did they have vis-à-vis the blood transfusion service?
Yes, I certainly had a relationship with the Department of Health. I should say, as far as my job description was concerned, these sort of reporting relationships weren't really spelt out. There was a sort of ultimate responsibility to the head of the Eastern Board, the Chief Administrative Officer. I think that was the only thing. In practice, I had a working relationship with the Chief Medical Officer of the Eastern Board, and with the Chief Medical Officer of Northern Ireland, of the Department of Health. Yes, and I did in practice have pretty regular communication on medical matters. Again, certainly with regard to the self-sufficiency issue. Important issues like that, and the HIV.
In your witness statement, we'll just put it up on screen, it's WITN 0892001, please, Sally. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the... yes, page 5. So it's the top of page 5. You've said there were no formal relationships with other blood services in the UK, but policies and procedures were often shared with other RTCs in GB and adopted by NIBTS. And then this was particularly appropriate because policies adopted by Department of Health and Social Services Northern Ireland typically followed those of DOH London, since Northern Ireland was under direct rule from London. What in practice was your understanding of the impact of what, as you described, their direct rule from London?
Just that, as it's stated here, the policies adopted in London tend almost invariably, I would say, certainly anything that affected NIBTS followed the policy in London. They're certainly, if you contrast that with post-direct rule, when the assembly was started, which I think was 1999, I think one would still have found that policies tended to follow DOH London. But on some issues, there might have started to be some divergence.
Did you yourself have any direct dealings with the Department of Health and Social Security in London?
No, that would have been via the department in Northern Ireland. So I can think of some committees, advisory committees in London. Concerning blood transfusion, I can think of one that the inquiry provided me with as an example, advisory committee on blood transfusion. But the representative from Northern Ireland on that was one of the medical people from our own Department of Health.
And then
not myself.
Did you have any significant dealings with health authorities or Department of Health in the Republic of Ireland in the 80s or 90s?
Not, I wouldn't have had any dealings with the Department of Health in the Republic of Ireland. Well, obviously our own department would have, but we had quite a lot of informal communication with at the blood transfusion level, mainly at a professional level. There were a lot of cross fertilization of ideas in various ways. At the medical level, there was the Irish Blood Club, which was mainly medical. There was a very active laboratory MLSO group that met on an annual basis between the Dublin service and ourselves. And also at the donor organization level, there were regular communications there, and there were even invitations to donor award events in both directions that I can recall, particularly in the early 80s or during the 80s.
Now, I just want to ask you a little next about the process of inspection by external agencies or organisations. Is it right to understand that your first recollection of an external inspection of the transfusion service was the 1981 visit by the Protein Fractionation Centre?
That's right, yes.
And we'll look at that in a little while. But as I understand it from your statement, personnel from the Protein Fractionation Centre would then subsequently carry out, from time to time, inspections of the processes and procedures at the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then your statement explains also that there was inspection by the Medicines Inspectorate of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. Your recollection is that the first one was December 1982, and then it was roughly every 2 years. Is that correct?
That's my recollection, yes.
And then if we can go back to your statement, WITN 0892001, and go to page 10, please. We pick it up at the bottom of this page. This is where you refer to the inspection by the Medicines Control Agency. The last 3 lines of that page, you say the granting of a manufacturing licence to NIBTS was delayed due to the inadequate premises. Indeed, this was a crucial factor in securing the eventual funding for a new NIBTS. And then we go to the top of the next page. Headquarters unit. The service relocated to the new current centre in 1995 and was granted a manufacturing licence after the first subsequent inspection. If we can just go back to the bottom of that previous page, Sally. Can you recall what it was about the premises that held up the grant of the licence, or what it was that the MCA was particularly concerned about?
I don't recall that the MCA identified any specific issue. I think it was just the general environment and the lack of insufficient space for a blood transfusion facility. I can't remember. I can't recall there was anything, any specific issue in that on the premises. Yeah.
You can take that down, thank you. I just wanted to ask you next a little about the kind of meetings that you held with others working in the transfusion service across the United Kingdom. You attended the meetings of the regional transfusion directors of England and Wales, I understand.
That's correct.
You also, following the establishment of the arrangements with the Protein Fractionation Centre, attended the directors' meetings of the SNBTS in Scotland.
That's correct.
Did you observe any particular differences between the way in which SNBTS operated and the way in which the blood transfusion service in England and Wales operated?
Well, I suppose the most obvious difference would have been the fact that it was Scotland had a national service, a nationally coordinated service, whereas in England, the service was delivered by 14 regional health authorities. So there was that attempt certainly to run a nationally coordinated service, albeit each regional centre seemed to have quite a lot of autonomy in their operations. There wasn't an absolute requirement to follow a national line. So I suppose national decisions were taken more by consensus than by diktat. Let's see, differences. I mean, there are certainly a lot of similarities. I think perhaps that's the most high level. At a high level, that was the most important difference. There was obviously an earlier approach in Scotland towards self-sufficiency, and which had quite a lot of influence in my own thinking, because Edinburgh was the first, going back to those placements, it was the first centre I had spent some time in, and I became very conscious of the importance of that.
Now, you've told us in your statement that you also attended an annual forum with Dr. Elizabeth Main, the Haemophilia Centre Director in Belfast, representatives of the Eastern Health Board. I don't think we have any minutes of those meetings, but can you recall broadly what their format and purpose were?
Yes, I can't remember what year those started. I suspect it was probably the middle 80s before those got underway. It was, the purpose was really to try and coordinate supplies with usage and demand for factor VIII and other coagulation concentrates. There was a great deal of concern at the management level, at the Eastern Board level, of the rapidly rising costs, and obviously the board wanted to understand how the system worked, perhaps how costs might be contained. So it was really a coordinating role with respect to supply and demand for those products.
Now, you've referred to self-sufficiency, and indeed we saw that as an objective identified in the annual reports that we looked at. Was attaining self-sufficiency a policy that was adopted really after you took up your job as director, or had it always been, in principle at least, the policy of the blood transfusion service?
I can't really speak about, of course, certainly pre-78 or even pre-1980. I think during most of the 70s, self-sufficiency would have meant maintaining supplies of blood and blood components at an extremely difficult time. I really do not know what kind of, I'm not aware of what kind of decision-making approach was taken during the 70s with respect to self-sufficiency and Factor VIII. I presume there would have been meetings involving the Department of Health, Blood Transfusion Service and the Haemophilia Centre on these matters, but I'm not sure. I really do not know what kind of policy was adopted. I wasn't conscious on joining the service that self-sufficiency in Factor VIII, for example, which is what it really came to mean in practice, I wasn't conscious that that was a major strategic decision or objective at that point.
So would it be right to understand that it's something which, after you became director, you consciously formulated a policy which may or may not have existed to some extent previously, but you consciously formulated a policy of wanting to achieve self-sufficiency in relation to factor concentrates for Northern Ireland?
Well, yes, I mean, as I mentioned, particularly when I spent time in Scotland, I became very conscious of this. I also, in discussion with Dr. Main, the haemophilia director, I was conscious, she was also very supportive of going down this route. And when I put to her the notion of changing fractionators so that we could start providing our own Factor VIII, she was supportive of that and very, very supportive.
At the time you took over as director, in relation to BPL, is it right to understand that it was only time-expired plasma that you were supplying to BPL?
That's right. That's right. It was only liquid plasma, which could not be used to make Factor VIII. And that seemed to be entirely because of logistical difficulties of shipping plasma had to be maintained at a very low temperature. I'm not sure if any how much effort was made to try and get around that problem. It certainly would have been difficult. So I don't know. But that was, yes, sorry, to answer your question, that's correct. It was only liquid plasma, time-expired plasma, if you like.
And the fresh frozen plasma that was produced in Northern Ireland was not being produced at that stage for fractionation?
No, that was purely for hospital use.
Is it correct, this is certainly what your statement suggests, that the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service was receiving what you've described in your statement as a very small amount of Elstree Factor VIII from BPL?
Yes, yes. I think it was in the region of 200,000 units of factor VIII, which would only have represented somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total. I have no idea how that arrangement or when that arrangement was made. But obviously, by, I think it was 80, 81, we ceased receiving that small allocation.
And your statement suggests that you were aware of there being capacity issues at BPL. So you've identified one problem, which was the transportation problem in relation to shipping fresh frozen plasma from Belfast to Elstree. But was it also your understanding that BPL might not have the capacity to fractionate fresh frozen plasma supplied by you?
Yes, it was my original assumption that we would start investigating sending some fresh frozen plasma to BPL, as I think letters to Dr. Lane illustrate. And I remember meeting with Dr. Lane to discuss aspects of this. But then I did become aware that there seemed to be capacity issues. In fact, there was something in the EMJ published which suggested that. And then I became aware that PFC may have spare capacity, so it made sense to investigate that. At the same time, this issue seemed to have been discussed at department level at one of those advisory committees, in which I'm not sure which came first, but this possibility of transferring was discussed quite early on at department level, as well as something that might transferring Northern Ireland's requirements from BPL to PFC.
If we just look at one document before we break, Dr. McClelland, and it's one of your letters to Dr. Lane on this issue, CBLA 0005101. So this is a letter from you, the 25th of September, 1980. So it's not long after you were taken over as director in June of 1980. Dear Dr. Lane, I'm writing to inform you of my plans for the supply of plasma to BPL in the near future. As you'll be aware, we've been sending you approximately 7,000 litres of liquid plasma per year. We have not provided any fresh frozen plasma for factor VIII production, but in view of our special difficulties in Northern Ireland, we have been receiving some 240,000 IU factor VIII per year. Following the recent proposals for the supply of factor VIII and albumin to regions in amounts pro rata with their input of raw material, I have formulated plans for the transport of fresh frozen plasma to BPL. These plans were submitted for funding to our local health authority several months ago, but I'm still awaiting final approval. Basically, I'm planning to introduce RIA for hepatitis testing and to purchase a liquid nitrogen refrigerator for the transport of FFP. We could then commence supply of FFP as soon as the new single transport pack becomes available to us. I would estimate that initially we could send about 2/3 of our present plasma supply in this form. I would welcome any comments, and in particular, it would be helpful if you could clarify a few points as follows. 1, is it envisaged that the special position of Northern Ireland with regard to the supply of factor VIII concentrates would cease after 1st of April 1981? 2, I was disturbed to read a recent letter in BMJ in which it is stated that BPL had not the capacity to handle extra plasma. Can you provide any reassurance on this point? And then over the page. the third point was about the availability of BPL's RIA reagents for hepatitis testing. I'll come back to hepatitis testing later, Dr. McClelland. If we go back to the first page, if we look at that second paragraph, what did you mean by our special difficulties in Northern Ireland in this context?
I assumed there had been some recognition that there were either, I think it would probably been referring to the Troubles. It could also have been referring partly to the difficulty of transport of fresh frozen plasma, but I suspect it was mainly our sort of recognition that special provision should be made for Northern Ireland in view of the pressure that the transfusion service was under to maintain a supply of blood and blood components.
And if we look at the paragraph numbered 1 towards the bottom of the page, the special position of Northern Ireland with regard to the supply of factor VIII concentrates, does that refer to the fact that although you sent no fresh frozen plasma to BPL for fractionation, you did receive some BPL factor VIII, albeit only a modest amount?
That's correct.
And we'll pick up after the break what then happened with PFC. I don't think we've got Dr. Lane's reply to this, but is it right to understand, can you recall, either whether it was through meeting or correspondence or some other format, what Dr. Lane's response in broad terms was?
I can't, I don't know if there was a response to this letter. Certainly I know that supply of factor VIII did cease. Certainly, I can't remember exactly when that happened, but it must have been, would cease after 1st of April 19. I think it probably did happen at that time, that the factor VIII supply from BPL did cease at that point.
Okay. So we can pick up the picture in relation to the PFC arrangements perhaps after the break.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
well, we'll do that. So we'll take a break now. We'll come back at 10 to 12. Let me tell you what I say to all witnesses at this stage, if not before, in their evidence. When there's a break, you may not discuss with anyone anything that you have been asked about already and anything you think you may yet be asked about in evidence. You can talk about anything else that you like.
Thank you, sir.
10 to 12.